My name is Joshua Frens-String, and I'm a fifth-year Ph.D. student in the History Department at NYU, focusing on 20th century Latin America. And my dissertation research, which I'm currently working on, focuses on Chile in the mid-20th century. And there's a history of ideas of capitalism and socialism in Chile and the role of consumer politics, the question of consumption, basically starting in the 1930s and going through the experiment in democratic socialism in Chile in the beginning of the 1970s. And it sort of rereads this whole period through the evolving understandings of a social welfare state and what a social welfare state is supposed to guarantee to its citizens, particularly looking at this idea to a basic right to consume issues like food, housing, shelter, which becomes sort of a platform for the first sort of socially democratic government in Chile in the 1930s, and then tracing the evolution of that project through its sort of peak in the 1970s and its dismantling after the coup in Chile of General Augusto Pinochet in 1973.
My name is Christy Thornton. I'm also a fifth-year Ph.D. student in the History Department here at NYU, and my dissertation focuses on Mexican internationalist projects and sort of the interwar period. And so I'm really looking at the ways in which Latin America generally, but Mexico specifically, influences multilateral institutions and international law and frameworks like that. So I've just returned from my fieldwork, and we're both starting to write our dissertations now.
So the title of the project, as it currently stands, is American Interdependencies, New Perspectives on Capitalism and Empire. And the project looks at the way in which U.S.-Latin American economic relations, sort of exchanges of ideas and actual economic practices, help shape the understanding of political economy in a world under U.S. hegemony. The project begins at the beginning of the 20th century and sort of the rise of U.S. empire after the Spanish-American War after 1898, and goes throughout the 20th century up until the Cuban Revolution, a moment we see as sort of a consolidation during the Cold War of total U.S. hegemony, and how Latin America served as sort of a crucible or workshop for different ideas about political economy. Right now, we're hoping to have a workshop, a conference that's planned for the winter of 2013 that brings together a number of papers of scholars working on different aspects of this relationship in different countries.
So one thing that we found when we were starting to think about this is that there are a lot of people, from a sort of interdisciplinary perspective, there are a lot of people working in cultural studies, ethnic studies, American studies, and history who have looked at the ways in which the experience of U.S. empire abroad affected cultural relations here at home. And so there's a broad body of scholarship that says when the U.S. goes and sort of has military bases or takes over in Puerto Rico or Cuba or Guam or the Philippines, any number of these places, sort of what are the ways in which that experience transfers back home to institutions, to norms, to these various ways in which U.S. culture is affected. And what we were sort of really interested in that paradigm coming out of cultural studies, but we both have a sort of abiding interest in the economy. And what we've discovered in our research and in networking with other scholars who are doing work more focused on the economy is that we have these same kinds of reciprocal interactions, the same sort of bringing these experiences from abroad back home in the economy. And so we're trying to look at the ways in which U.S. capitalism in the 20th century is sort of made through these experiments of the U.S. abroad. And so we both work on this, and the people who we're working with here at NYU, Greg Grandin and Jill Lane, both have an abiding interest in Latin America. And so we're really focusing on the way in which U.S. capitalism is sort of developed through these iterative processes, these reciprocal processes of how the U.S. state and U.S. capital interacts abroad. And we both work with Greg Grandin, a professor in the history department. And Greg has been doing a lot of work around the world, really, about the role that Latin America has played in shaping U.S. history. And so this was the beginning of a project where we started reaching out to other people who maybe had previously thought of the work that they were doing in a sort of narrowly defined way, right? We have Latin Americanists who sort of work in one silo. We have U.S. historians who work in another, cultural studies people who work here, comparative literature people. And so what we wanted to do was kind of bring together people who might all have these same interests to cross these kind of disciplinary borders. And so we got together with the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at NYU with its director, Jill Lane, and kind of came up with this project. And we decided that the best thing to do would be to hold this 2-day conference that we're going to do in the winter, spring. And so we're in the process now of shaping that conference, of inviting the participants, and we're actually going to put out a call for papers in hopes that we get more people who aren't the people who we already know in our networks. And so I think that's sort of where we've come from and where we're headed.
We've also had the chance to sort of have a couple of test runs of different aspects of this conference. Christy and I have put together a couple of panels over the last 2 years, one at the Latin American Studies Association conference, and then another more recently at the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations conference that deal with different aspects of this larger project, talking about the relationship of the United States to Latin America, but in specifically economic terms, looking at, again, the combination of economic ideas and then actual practices, the politics of how these ideas are worked out in this relationship between Latin America and the United States, which is really an understudied area. There's a lot of work on U.S. and Latin American relations, but understanding in a global context the rise of U.S. hegemony and the way in which Latin America served really as a crucible for the United States to work out its own ideas about what its empire would look like.
And so we've been fortunate in that process to meet scholars from all around the country and really all around the world who are working on these sorts of things. And so this project really grows out of some conversations that we had with a professor at the University of Toronto, Augustin Sedgwick, who was a recent graduate of a recent Ph.D. from Harvard. And so we got together and started thinking about those things. And so now we've been able to sort of involve other institutes and centers, not only here in New York City, but we're starting to make connections to other places around the country and around the world. One of the things that we're looking at in this conference is the sort of concept of technologies of control, technologies of rule. And so how does the U.S. come to be the hegemon, not just in Latin America, but around the world in this period in the 20th century? This is really the rise of the U.S. as the global hegemon, right? And so one of the things that we're interested in are sort of what are the mechanisms through which that happens with regard to economics. And a lot of those things are technologies in the broader sense. So things like finance, how finance works, that sort of thing. But definitely also communication strategies, the ways in which people understand how money or information flows back and forth between these things can be really important. But because we're really interested in the early 20th century, the technological profile is obviously really different than it is today. And so one of the things that we're kind of engaging with is scholarship about globalization and about how sort of technological change has created this era of globalization. And we're trying to say that there was actually this strong interaction in an earlier period than maybe people who care about globalization want to think about. And so even though you don't have the sort of split-second technologies of communication, you still have a lot of this exchange going back and forth. And so we're looking at what the mediums of that are and what the technologies that enable that.
And I think even more than the idea of technology sort of narrowly defined, I mean, the parameters of the project really focus on the issue of politics, how political conflict, contestation determine or shape the conditions for these sort of new technologies that emerge. So it's less, a lot of the scholarship coming out of cultural studies or comparative literature has focused on a sort of diffusionist model where there's technologies or ideas about how the economy should be run, technologies as ideas being spread from the United States down to Latin America. And a lot of the impetus for this project was to show the role of Latin America, the active role of Latin American countries in shaping these ideas about new technologies of economic control, of economic regulation, and how Latin America really played an active, protagonistic role in the shaping of what came to be U.S. empire in the 20th century. So I think intellectually, my trajectory to arrive at this project has come through sort of a grappling with the history of economic ideas in Latin America, particularly a theory that still gets tossed around today, but not necessarily as much as it once did, understandings of dependency in Latin America. So there's a huge body of scholarship about what's called dependency theory. Latin America really was at the sort of cutting edge, on the vanguard of thinking about what it meant to be a dependent economy, to not necessarily have complete control over your natural resources, which in the case of Latin America was central to economic development and economic growth, and how that sort of shaped the the history of political and economic development more broadly in the region. A lot of those ideas were quickly dismissed in the 70s and 80s after a number of military coups in different parts of Latin America came in and instituted structural adjustment programs that dismantled the social welfare state, dismantled ideas of developmentalism, that the state had a place as an active intervener in the economy to stimulate growth. Ideas of economic nationalism sort of fell by the wayside. A lot of the literature since then has ignored ideas of political economy altogether because of the shortcomings of dependency theory as they were made manifest in practice. And so I think returning to a lot of these ideas is a very interesting and sort of provocative call that we're putting forward, ideas that were challenged for the last 2 or 3 decades, but really had an important role in understanding how Latin America saw itself in relationship to the rest of the world. So if we want to have a conference in which Latin America is at the forefront as an active political agent, re-engaging with a lot of these ideas about dependency, I think, is central, and I think has shaped sort of ideas of how we move forward beyond dependency, thinking about the interactions between these two. But I think that's been a sort of a key intellectual inspiration that's sort of drawn me into this project more fully.
Yeah, we're calling this project American Interdependencies because we do want to push back on this notion of kind of the global hegemon sort of giving what it's going to give and the rest of the world having to take, or having to give what it has to the global hegemon. What we're really interested in are these kinds of reciprocal interactions that happen in the economy. And so for me, like Josh, I sort of came to this through thinking about the history of the very idea of development, right? And so as we entered the kind of era of globalization, it became really easy to have one idea about what development meant, right? We have this idea of the underdeveloped world, and everybody knows what that means now, right? That we've supplanted the third world, which was the Cold War paradigm, with the underdeveloped world. And so everybody knows that that means Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia. And so my interest was in sort of how we came to this idea, how Latin America starts to fit in as underdeveloped, given where Latin America started, which was as this huge storehouse of natural resources with really with a long history of independent statehood, right? So independence happens in Latin America 100 years before it happens in those other regions where European colonialism was overthrown. And so sort of the idea of how Latin America gets into this category, there's a famous idea of how Latin America becomes underdeveloped. And so that question has been motivating for me in my scholarship in thinking about how the Latin Americans themselves, and in my dissertation, how Mexicans saw the process of development, of the development of capitalism, of the development of their economies, and how they understood their place in the world, right? Because I think a lot of times the common sense sort of reads back the current place in the world as though it was historically unchanging, as though it was fated, right? That a place like Mexico should be poorer than a place like the United States. And I think that, especially in the early 20th century, throughout Latin America, there was no reason to believe that that was going to be true. And so thinking about what these actors in the state, in Latin American capitalism, really wanted to do for their national economies and for the global economy really gives us a different perspective on what were the alternative possible futures that existed, right? So that we don't have a narrative where the sort of collapse of state intervention in the economy, what was called import substitution industrialization, as you go into the 70s, that collapse sort of inevitably leads to neoliberalism and the kind of decline that we've seen really up until the last maybe 10 or 15 years. So sort of challenging that conventional view that takes the current state of affairs and looks backward is one thing that I think really motivates both Josh and I when we're thinking about Latin American economies and how they relate to the United States.
I think there's also just a very sort of contemporary issue that I know has attracted both Christy and I to our respective projects, and that's sort of Latin America's economic resilience over the last 10 or 15 years amidst sort of a global financial meltdown. How did Latin America sort of survive unscathed? I mean, this has sort of been a question that journalists and commentators have engaged with a lot over the last 5-10 years. How Latin America, by providing social safety nets, by providing sort of an active state role in the economy, has been able to withstand one of the largest economic meltdowns since the Great Depression. And I think tracing the current moment back to a lot of these ideas about what a national economy should do, what the state role in the economy should do, what economic regulation is, how broad political coalitions are formed in order to enact a certain economic program, all speak back to an earlier history.
If you had said to scholars who were working on Latin America 20 years ago that there would be a huge global crash and that Latin America that the United States economy would decline rapidly and that Latin America would be more or less unaffected, it would have been unthinkable, because the understanding of how Latin American economies were linked, were in this dependent position with the U.S. economy, said that that was impossible, right? And so when this historical fact becomes true and there is this huge downturn in the US and it's not really seen in that same way throughout Latin America, you have to ask the question, why? What underpins that kind of stability? What underpins and the political changes that have been happening in Latin America in those last 2 decades? So that's really been a motivating factor for us as we sort of look for the historical roots of this. And so we're trying to bring together a kind of broad group of scholars who are working not only on Latin America, but on the US, and not only people who are focused on history, but also in other disciplines, to try and answer this question of sort of how did we come to be where we are? And what are the historical specificities in politics and economics that underpin this moment, that make this moment possible?
A lot of what's gone into the conference is this one idea about sort of Latin America's role in international history and global history. There's been a lot of work over the last decade or two about sort of what's called the new international history. An idea that's really focused on Europe and the United States, Latin America, and a few other parts of sort of the global South have been left out of a lot of these conversations. So we want to sort of place Latin America at the center of this understanding of what global history means, what the new international history means. And then a second sort of, I guess, inspiration as well is what's been called the history of capitalism, another area that is focused almost exclusively on the United States and Europe. But we believe that through this conference, we'll be able to give sort of this dynamic relationship between the United States and Latin America a central role, a central place in understandings of the development of capitalism in the 20th century.
There's been a strong transnational turn in historical studies in the last decade or so. And what that's meant is that people are examining processes that sort of aren't confined within a single nation state, that cross over between nation states. And thus far, a lot of what has been focused on has been sort of cultural and social issues. And we're really trying to make an argument that we need to examine political economy with this same framework, that people understanding histories of capitalism, histories of state economies need to also take this transnational turn, because that's the way in which these ideas really flowed and were worked out. And so we really want to focus specifically on that economic aspect. So the conference will happen in the spring of 2013. It'll be a 2-day conference that'll bring together 12 to 15 scholars from throughout the Americas to work on especially these questions about interdependencies between U.S. and Latin American capitalisms and state structures. And so we have received support as well from the New York City Latin American History Workshop, from the NYU History Department, and from NYU Center for Caribbean and Latin American Studies. And we're actually reaching out to other humanities initiatives throughout the country and sort of throughout North America, so that we can begin to bring together a sort of broader network, not just of scholars working together, but of institutes kind of supporting this effort. And so we think that it'll be a really successful conference, and we're really lucky to be able to host it here at NYU.